Hey guys, and welcome back to Bridge the Gap. My name is Jessica Leichtweisz, and I'm the CEO of Hope Education Services. I've been working with children with autism for 12 years, and what I've found is that autistic adults have some amazing feedback for us professionals on how we can be better professionals and understand more about autism. That's why I created this show, Bridge the Gap, where I invite you to come on and learn from autistic adults. So tonight I'm really excited about bringing the guest on the show. She's someone who I share a lot of the same similar interests and passions about. And this person, like many of our guests, was diagnosed as an adult. We find that's a much more common theme as more information is being known about autism, as it's becoming more common. Many adults are going back and getting diagnosed as autistic that maybe didn't as a child. And it answers so many questions that they had their entire life. So this person is going to come on, share a little bit about her story. Her name is Becca Lory. She is an author, a speaker, a neurodiversity and inclusion expert and consultant, and also just an amazing human being and animal lover, just like myself. So Becca, welcome to the show today.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
It's my pleasure. So you were diagnosed as being autistic when you were 36 years old.
Yes.
So what was it like for 36 years? What made you decide at that age to go and seek out a diagnosis?
Mm-hmm.
At that, people often look at adults that are being diagnosed later as autistic and thinking, oh, well, it's not really autism, but it's not the case. It's really just information wasn't known.
Yeah. And I think for me, I didn't go out and choose to get diagnosed. It kind of unfolded that way. It kind of fell into my lap, which is sort of interesting. So I had struggled my whole life with many things. I'd been misdiagnosed with many, many things. But I had always sort of struggled with being normal and doing the supposed to things and all of that stuff. And so I struggled a lot with employment, which is really the biggest challenge, I think, for autistic adults today, is getting employment, keeping employment, and staying happy while you're employed. I think that's our biggest adult struggle right now. And so even though I wasn't diagnosed, I was still struggling with employment because without the label, I was still autistic. So I still struggled with employment. And after I did my 15th job in 13 years, I turned to my mom and I said, I give up. I don't understand. I don't know what else I can do. I'm not sure I know, but I give up. I'm clearly not meant to be here on this planet. And I climbed into my childhood bed and I spent 3 years in bed in my childhood bedroom, not leaving the house and completely suicidal. The only reason I didn't kill myself at the time was because I was living with my mom and I'm her only child, and I didn't want her to find my body. And that reality is a reality for many of us on the spectrum. We reach a point in our lives and we don't understand what's going on and we don't know how to fix it anymore. And we're out of the energy to work anymore at it. And we just burn out, give up, right? And so that's where I was. And so for 3 years, so from 33 to 36, I was in that bed. And at 36 years old, I had suffered for a very long time with migraines, or what I thought were migraines. And they started to change on me a little bit. And I was getting an olfactory smell with preceding them, and I couldn't understand it. And nobody else could smell the smell. So it became an obsession of mine to try to kind of find where the smell was coming from. And I was doing it from my bed. So I was on WebMD and I was in Wikipedia and I was on Google and I was just trying to find out. And I was looking at hallucinations and brain tumors and all kinds of things. And along the way, I found sensory processing disorder. And that one was so familiar to me. I was like freaked out by it a little bit. I was like, wow, this is like been my whole life was like this. I didn't know it was a thing, you know? And then I clicked a little bit further down in the article and there was Asperger's syndrome. And so when I clicked on it, I felt was reading my biography, like someone had watched my life and put it on Wikipedia. And so it's from that place that I went for my diagnosis. It was really not where I said, oh, I think I have autism, let me go get a diagnosis. I had never heard of Asperger's. I had never really considered myself a possibility for autism because I grew up in the 80s. And in the 80s, kids with autism didn't speak. And they were violent and they went to separate schools and that kind of stuff. And so there was no way anybody was going to be looking, especially as a girl. They weren't going to be looking for me to be autistic. And so it was really the first time that word entered my world was at 36. And it changed everything. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, oftentimes girls tend to not get a diagnosis. And we talked about this on last week's show that autism presents differently in girls than it does in boys. So boys tend to be just generally more rambunctious than girls. They tend to process things differently, and not just boys that are on the spectrum or autistic boys, but all boys, right? Boys are louder. Boys are, they act out more. Whereas autistic girls, they tend to be really well behaved in school. They tend to be very, very quiet. They tend to be very good at following rules. And so they tend to be the teacher's favorite students because typically they're smart. They get the content. They don't require a lot of help. They're very independent. They're quiet and they follow the rules. So they tend to fall under the cracks, but internally there's so much going on. And one of my favorite quotes is, just because you experience a person's autism mildly doesn't mean that they experience their autism mildly. And,
I think that's why, what I'm hearing now, and I love this because we have been on a search for how do we describe that, right? How do we talk about that? We know saying mildly or severely isn't the right way to talk about it, right? Those words don't work because it's severe to all of us. It's just how it presents, right? And then how do we talk? Do we say high functioning, low functioning? Well, that's a terrible way to do it because you're just deciding on these random things, what's high functioning. Because I can tell you, as a high functioning individual, I am non-functioning many days. And so I don't ever feel high functioning. I don't know what that is. I think when we talk about that experience of it and why it's so different for girls and boys, the real difference is, and Dina Gassner talks about this, and I am not going to steal it from her, I'm going to give her credit. She talks about it all the time, and we say it's internalized autism versus externalized autism. So what people think needs a lot of support and is considered severe are the people that are the externalizers, the ones that are, their autism is interfering with their communication with the outside world, right? That's where the struggles are. And for the internalizers, our struggles are all happening where you can't see them or experience them. And so they're totally personal and they're inside. And it's because so many of the girls learn to be internalizers, we don't ever show our autism. There's no way that a person walking down the street would ever know. And that's kind of the place that we come from. And that's because of how we tell girls to behave. We tell them to be quiet. We tell them to not give their opinion. We tell them to follow the rules and be a good girl and all of those things. So, you reap what you're getting, that's what's happening. But yeah, it's a definite struggle. And I think my lifetime timing was just off. I was born in 76, so it was the 80s, ripe and ready. And when I was in elementary school, where they would be looking for me, right? And instead of, they weren't, because I was speaking and I was a girl, so they didn't look, right? And even though I was having struggles throughout there, those things were placed on me as a child. It was all my fault that all of these things weren't happening. Right. And so that's kind of you learn then to internalize even more when that's what's going on. So I then turned 18 and graduated high school in 1994, which is the year that Asperger's hit the DSM. So even when they started looking for people like me, I was already out of school. So nobody was going to look for me. Right. And then I was, just struggling in adulthood, the way we see autistics now struggle, diagnosed autistics struggle in adulthood.
Yeah, and I think it's important that people watching this show who don't necessarily realize that the definition of what autism is has changed over time. And even in my career, so I started working with kids with autism in 2008. At that point, we were in the DSM-4. There were 5 types of autism. You had autistic disorder, which would be like the classic low functioning, so to speak, autism that was associated in the 70s and 80s of like kids, like you said, who were nonverbal and who had severe learning disabilities and who couldn't really function in everyday life skills independently in terms of like toileting and bathing and eating. And that's what was considered autism for a really long time. So now you have that being in 2008 being part of the spectrum. And then you had PDD NOS. So that was basically meant it wasn't necessarily that low functioning autism, but it didn't meet Asperger's, which, like you said, came in the DSM-3, which came out in 1994. And that was like basically, so Asperger's is that very high functioning autism. So it was kind of this in the middle. And then we had Rett syndrome and childhood disintegrative disorder. Those were both identified as, they found the genes for those and they separated those out of the spectrum. So it left basically 3 types of autism in the current DSM, which is the DSM-5. So today, we talk about labeling. And like you said, instead of, high functioning and low functioning have been colloquial terms. I think that they're used too much by teachers and too much by professionals, and parents are always looking for those labels. But autistic people never use those terms. I've never heard anyone who's autistic identify themselves as being high functioning or low functioning.
No, it's an insulting way to identify somebody. First of all, you might have met them on the worst day of their lives, so of course they're going to look low functioning. You have no idea what they were going through that day or the day before, right? And so some days I look very high functioning, but I may be internally struggling, or I may be on my very last spoon, or I may be, whatever is going on. And the next day I'm going to look really different from how I looked the day before, right? And the other thing that I love is that parents get this label put on their kids when they're really young, but we talk about it all the time. We say it. It's a developmental disorder, which means that your kids are developing and changing. And so they may be low functioning at one point, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to stay low functioning. So I, as an adult, look nothing like what I presented like at 6 years old, right? Because I've had a lifetime of coping mechanisms and habits added to my life. And so I think that's the stuff that we need to keep in mind when we're so desperately trying to find a label for something that doesn't really need one. Like, none of us on the spectrum really need any label beyond the autism, right? It's like, oh, I get it, you're autistic, I'm autistic. Well, I'm 100% more comfortable in a room with a low functioning autistic than I am with any other NT ever. Like, I'm more comfortable with my people. It doesn't matter what part of the spectrum they sit on. Right. And so that's the part that's important.
Yeah. And I think it's like you said, it's coming up with like identifying, is there a reason for this answers? And I feel like for parents, because on the other side of this, of the perspective, I talk to parents every day working directly with kids. Since I'm working with kids, I'm obviously interacting with parents. And so the parents, to them, they want a label and they want to know it. And I think it comes down to, and one of my best friends, she has a child who, quote unquote, has high functioning autism, where other parents will reject her as being an autism parent because their child struggles more with certain things.
Right.
And, that's why they've come up with this, like in the DSM-5, this solution tried to be, well, we're not going to say Asperger's, we're not going to say autism. And then again, that creates the confusion as to what autism is. So they said the levels 1, 2, and 3. And they define levels 1, 2, and 3 by talking about how much support a person needs. But like you said, it's difficult because it's not really true that somebody who presents to professionals as having high functioning autism, again, I'm putting it in quotes, but because we know it's not a real thing, but putting it in quotes, high functioning autism, because the reality of it is that the things that people struggle with or may not be things we can see, but that doesn't mean they need less support. It means, honestly, that neurotypical people and professionals and parents, they need less support to interact with them. So I think that that's something that we need to understand, is that it's just because a person struggles differently doesn't mean they don't need the same level of support. Right. You might not need someone to coach you, 3 times a week on how to talk, but you might need someone to help coach you 3 times a week on processing things emotionally or coping with sensory stimulus. So, everybody has individual needs, and it's very hard to try to label it. But then there are also some benefits to having a label.
Well, that's
it helps you understand yourself.
It helps you understand yourself, and also because of the way that the world is set up, it is your access to supports. So the irony of this whole thing is, as high functioning as I may be, in order to keep my social security, disability, and my supports from the government, I have to appear as low functioning as possible to them, right? And so that concept is so ridiculous, because one day I can go in again and present high functioning, the next day I could be low functioning, and so I might have low support needs on one day, but I might have high support needs the next day, right? There are days when I just can't cook. I don't remember to eat. I don't remember to go to the bathroom because my spoons are just gone, right? And I revert almost back to when I didn't know how to cope with those things. I just literally, my brain is too tired or my body is too tired, whatever it is, and it's enough. And then I need a support person. And I'm lucky enough to have my husband, and he's happy enough to be my support person. But that's not always the case for adults on the spectrum. Many of us, and I was for a very long time, are happy alone. So what happens when you're happy alone, but you're struggling with something that you can't get supports for, right? And it's those things that are really where there's division between labels. So the parents are taught to seek these labels because that's how they get supports for their kids. And without the label, they can't get the supports. And the worse they can make it sound, the better supports they get for their kid. So that's then the poor child now has the self-esteem of somebody who is being told all the time that they can't do anything, right? And what the parents forget is that that label is going to change on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, on a yearly basis, through that child's lifetime. They're going to have days where they are high functioning and days where they are low functioning, days when they need more supports or less supports, right? And so I think that the impermanence of a label is something that I really want to push on people, is that it's not a permanent label. It's not stamped on your forehead, right? Like, and I always use the example of when we took Asperger's out, right? I got diagnosed, all of my paperwork says Asperger's syndrome, right? Because that's what it was. Those were the charts and the codings that we were supposed to use, and all of the government bureaucracy stuff, right? Not the human being stuff. And that label was put on me. Okay, when the DSM-5 came out and they pulled Asperger's out of the book, it doesn't mean I don't have Asperger's anymore. And it doesn't mean that I'm not autistic anymore either. None of that has changed just because the labels themselves have changed. And that is something also important, right? Because it was an identity crisis to have grown up at 36 and think you are normal, and then to find out that at 36 you actually are disabled, will be disabled for the rest of your life, and have been disabled your entire life, right? There's a lot to work through in there. And I think understanding that even when I didn't have the label of Asperger's or autism, I was still autistic all of that time, proves that those labels they aren't permanent. They're just what we have access to right now. And the research is continuing, and adults are still speaking out, and people are writing. And as we glean that information, the world will change and the labels will change, and we have to go with that flow, you know?
Yeah. One of the
Nothing
things
is permanent.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the questions I get every day from parents is that, should I get a diagnosis? And the fear is that your child's going to be mislabeled, the diagnosis will be wrong, and especially when children are young, because we diagnose children very, very early. The reality of it is, though, unfortunately, if you don't get the diagnosis, there's no diagnostic code. And if there's no diagnostic code, insurance won't pay for anything.
Correct.
Also, there's like an entire support that becomes available to you. So, if you're an adult with, that's autistic, if you go to a job and you ask for workplace accommodations, you have the ADA to cite saying you're required to accommodate my disability reasonably within as long as I can continue to perform this job. But, if you can't do that, if for whatever reason there's no diagnosis. Right. But I think that
we can't, but right now we're in a funky place, I think, in terms of, it helps very much, I think, with the children. I'm still a big proponent of, those early diagnoses for kids. And I really think the parents worry so much about the label so early, but that's their crap. That's as a parent, and I'm calling you out, parents, that's your garbage. That is the garbage that you're carrying with you from your lifetime of knowing what it meant to be disabled and gleaning all the stigma that society has put in your head. And now suddenly that stigma is about your child. Right? And so what you need to do is remember that stigma is not so good. And yes, you're sorry you carry this baggage, but the goal is not to pass that baggage on to your kid. That with the diagnosis doesn't come all your baggage about what it means to be that thing, right? That's for your kid to decide what it means for them to be autistic, right? But if you don't have, as a kid, I know probably by the time I was 2, I knew I was different. By the time I was 8, I was already suffering with the depression, anxiety of no diagnosis, of the no identity. So if parents can imagine, if I already knew it too, and you're having a diagnosis available to you, and I already had some knowledge of it at 2 years old, what you're doing is you're depriving your child of their knowledge of themselves, and you're depriving yourself and them of learning how to make informed decisions from that information. Right? And you're also denying yourselves, both of you, all of you, the financial supports that come with the diagnosis. As an adult, backwards. As an adult, I disagree almost entirely with seeking a diagnosis formally, because right now we're fully unsupported in that vein. There aren't a lot of clinicians that specialize in adult diagnosis. There aren't a lot of clinicians who will deal with female adult diagnosis. If you do find those people, it's not covered by insurance, so you're paying out of pocket. Most of us pay somewhere between $6,000 and $8,000 a diagnosis, which since most of us are on disability or unemployed, we can't afford. And there are no low cost diagnosis. It's not, no insurance companies want to cover it in adulthood. It's still being considered something in childhood that you grow out of, and that there's no way you could make it to adulthood without knowing this thing about you, right? And so as an adult, even if you want accommodations in the workplace, sometimes a diagnosis is completely out of your reach for whatever reason. And on the other side of it, even if you have one, it's kind of dangerous to disclose in the workplace these days. It's still a really double-edged sword to say to people that you have autism when there's still so much stigma, because instantaneously people start to tell you to look for other workplaces. They start to treat you like a child. They blame any of your issues that you're having in the workplace on you and your autism. It can't be anybody else. And so it becomes very difficult to be an educated, professional adult who can handle most of their adult life with some support, and then not be able to maintain employment while being your authentic self, right? Because none of us really can. I know a lot of people that are autistic and work in disability world, work in autism organizations, who will not disclose their autism because of the stigma. And so I say there's a big difference between seeking diagnosis as a child and seeking diagnosis as an adult right now. The world hasn't changed enough for it to be necessarily worthwhile for everybody.
Yeah, and that's what this show is all about. It's actually trying to change that. And, you know, I try to get this show in front of as many people as possible. And at the time we're actually doing this, it's on 4 public access television stations. So, you know, the potential reach there is over 1 million people. You know, it's on my YouTube channel, and I post it all over my social media. And even though this show is targeted, it was initially targeting, you know, parents of children with autism. I do find now it's being watched mostly by autistic adults, but I want this show to be in front of everybody, because as a society, we need to be more aware of what autism is, because we need to be more accepting and loving and understanding. You know, and I spoke to a parent today, and I said, the goal is not to change your child or make them less autistic. When I first started working in
that was the goal, right?
Yeah, when I first started working in the field of autism, it was in the height of the autism recovery movement. It was like when all these studies were coming out showing that, you know, the kids who received in the ABA initially, that they recovered from autism, that their symptoms went away, and, you know, Dan doctors were a thing, and recovery was possible, as all of the bumper stickers and the t-shirts, and I wore them myself. And, you know, I told parents, we're going to make sure your child is not going to be autistic anymore. And that was the goal, was one day we're going to get this diagnosis removed and your kid is not going to have autism. And we know today, well, that's not really true. The truth is that your child needs to be accepted. They need to be loved. They need to be understood. And you want to help them by giving them the support they require to be the best possible version of themselves. In that process, you want to change them as little possible, and you want to accept and love who they are, but you also want to make sure that they get to choose who they want to be. And you want to give them as many choices as possible. And the more skills that you can give a child, the more skills you can get a child to learn, the more choices that they have when they become an adult as to who they want to be. And then
that's what it is.
Accept and love.
I am so jealous of all of these kids that got diagnosed right before a certain age, because even though we now know how harmful ABA can be and all of those things, this is that everything changes and labels aren't permanent thing. Again, at that time, that was all anybody knew. That was the newest, best information we had. And I think what we were seeing in those studies is that some form of intervention was better than no intervention, right? Those kids were seeing results partially because suddenly there was an awareness, there was something different about them, and they had to learn skill sets that made, right? And so that's that self-knowledge piece that I talk about making decisions from. Like, any decision I made before 36 was made uninformed, because I wasn't making choices through the lens of autism, which is how I function. I was not using anything. I didn't have words for meltdown. I was having them all over the place, and people thought I was a nut job, but I didn't have the word meltdown because I didn't have a diagnosis. So I couldn't, I'm having a what?
Yeah.
This is what's happening, right? And that is endlessly frustrating. So for 36 years, those were my experiences. There's no word for the thing. Okay, I'm the only one that has that then, because there's no word for it, right? And what we are doing for those kids, even when we were doing ABA regularly, was giving them the knowledge, the self-knowledge that their brain works differently and that they can control their input and output and all of those things. And those are those emotional regulation pieces that As an adult, if you haven't managed emotional regulation, forget workplace. Workplace is a no-go, right? And if they're giving these kids now those tools where they're like, oh, right now I'm angry about the red crayon. I'm really angry about it because I wanted the red crayon and that kid has it. And now I'm going to process through what that means so that when I'm 43 like me and I don't get a job that I was really looking forward to getting and someone else gets it, my whole life doesn't go into a tailspin, right? Because I have learned skill sets to maintain my emotional control and to understand what's going to happen to my body. But without that, we're clueless. I mean, you're making uninformed decisions all the time. And so that's part of this self-defined living stuff that I talk about, is because I want to give back to the adults that didn't have that chance, to all the me's out there, and teach them how to get that back. Teach them how to do the early interventions that we didn't get as an adult. How can we do that? And so I've pulled a lot of stuff from mindfulness because I think that's the best way in for adults. I think that's our best techniques. And I've pulled a lot from the NT world and I've changed it to be workable for autistics, to make sense to our brains, because we don't get those early interventions. We didn't get them. And so, yeah, I think we have to, it's a balancing act though, because some of those kids are over supported. And then as adults, they don't know how to make independent decisions. They've completely lost how to trust their own gut, and all of those connections have been severed. So we over support. And I think now we're swinging back on the pendulum from over supporting to somewhere in the middle. Right. And that balance is what folks need, is just to find that balance in their own life. Every one of us, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's interesting you talk about labels constantly changing. And I'm also someone who practices mindfulness and study mindfulness. And I also am trained in ABA and I have a degree in behavior science. And it's interesting because just like autism has changed, what ABA has changed. And like what ABA is today, it's still called ABA, but it's unrecognizable from its original form as to what it's done. So just like that, the labels of even what ABA has changed. And a lot of times people talk about the harmful effects of ABA. And yes, there were harmful effects of ABA the way it was done 20, 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. I mean, by the time I started doing ABA, all that like bad stuff was taken out. There was still some teaching procedures that I don't think were bad or harmful or punitive, like some of the things that were really horrible, honestly, you can go to jail for, that people were doing 20, 30 years ago. If you did it today, you'd be in prison.
I mean, people aren't up in arms about ABA for no reason.
Right. It did had a dark history, but that label has changed. Today, right. I guarantee you, if you were not another ABA person, you would never know what I was doing was ABA. I'm playing with kids, and I'm just kind of doing things in a slightly different way to promote language development. So, and just kind of like that label has changed as well. But I'm also a huge believer in mindfulness. I include that in my practice. I use even affirmations with the children I work with.
And that helps with the emotional regulation piece, I think, right? Like, to me, that's a valuable tool for every human being. A lot of the stuff that we talk about in terms of supports for adults on the spectrum is actually stuff, it's really quality of life measures that we're talking about. That's what we're looking to change, is the quality of adulthood, quality of life of adulthood for autistics. And I think when we talk about mindfulness, we kind of break into all the stuff that the masking comes from. Because all of a sudden, right, there you have old habits where you become anxious, and so the reaction to being anxious is to go into the habit of masking and to blah, blah, instead of saying, I'm anxious because this thing, and should I change this thing so I don't have to be anxious? But instead, we just mask our anxiety and make it okay, right? And so it's about breaking into that and saying, wait a second, I'm mindful that I'm anxious. What am I anxious about? Can I change that thing? Can I do less of that thing? Should I do something else about it to make, right? And so just stopping for those moments. And then I take it a step further and I ask people to look at the bigger concepts in their life and take it apart in that same mindful way. When, like a word I use often to explain it to people is the word tired. A lot of us throw that word out all the time. I'm so tired, I can't. I'm tired. But what we really mean is I'm depressed. I'm not interested. I don't have the energy to do it right now, right? We can mean any number of other things, or I'm stressed or anything, but we use the word tired. That's the one that comes out, right? But it's not what we mean. And that is something that I think we do with big concepts, like the concepts of family, right? What does the word family mean to you? The word friend, right? What does success mean to you? That's another one. And a lot of us are chasing the definitions that have been imparted upon us rather than looking apart and saying, you know what though? The things that I'm chasing to be successful aren't the things that I think are successful about other people. So why aren't I chasing what I think is success instead of chasing what other people think is success? Because when you do that, you start to follow your heart and you start to follow your strengths instead of your weaknesses, and you start to have the success that you're seeking. And that you can build on that momentum instead of constantly chasing your deficits down, constantly running down all the things you're not good at and trying to get good at them instead of banking on what you're already good at. And so that's sort of the place that I come from.
Yeah, and I love that, and it's such a powerful message, you know. And we do have to close the show out. We've actually gone a little bit over tonight, so thank you everybody for staying on with us. But yeah, it's such a powerful message, and this idea that supporting people, not changing people, but supporting people, and help them with identify their strengths and help them to become the best versions of who they are. And you know, that's our job, not to change people, but to support people to be the best versions of themselves. Now, I actually would love to continue learning from you. I think you're amazing. I've never heard anybody apply quite the way you are, the mindfulness to work with people that are autistic. I would love to check out your content. I know you said you have a YouTube channel. So how can parents who are watching this get onto your YouTube channel in order to learn more from you?
Well, I've made it super easy for everybody. If you search my name, you can find all of my social media, or if you just go to my website, which is beccalory.com, I've linked you to everything, my writing, my YouTube channel, all my social media, anything that I'm a part of is on that website. What I'm doing with the YouTube channel now is actually an extension of what I'm doing on my Facebook and LinkedIn. So in those two mediums, I started a group about neurodiversity news where everybody just we all share the news that's out there that we're all seeing, good, bad, and different, share our opinions. But I require that everyone remain respectful to each other because we're a mixed group. It's not just autistics, we're parents, we're autistic parents, we're autistic professionals, regular professionals, we're all mixed, and it's international. So it would be really easy to disrespect and offend other people if we weren't being mindful about the language that we're using. And so that's what's required to be a part of our group, is to be open-minded, be respectful of others' opinions, and to share yours with respect. And in those groups, we were having so much fun. But I was hearing from people is that they couldn't keep up with it. It was too much reading. There was too many articles. So I started a 20-minute vlog once a week. I do on Fridays, and I take our most commented on in both of the groups, the articles, the blogs, the events, the books, whatever we think is out and good that everyone's enjoying, and I give people the highlights on the YouTube channel.
That's awesome. So I look forward to checking that out. And the links to that for everyone who wants to see it, they will all be in the show. I'm going to definitely join that group. So expect a request from me on LinkedIn. So if you loved this show, if you want to just see more of my content, you can head over to my website. It's hopeeducationservices.com if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're watching this on public television and you want to see more of these episodes, that is on my YouTube channel that you can get to by going to getautismanswers.com. So Becca, thank you so much for being on here. It was amazing to have you. I learned so much from you tonight. I look forward to continuing the conversation and continuing to work together.